Thank you, Henry, Alexa, and everyone here. For those of you who might not be familiar with my organization, the National Bureau of Asian Research is a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank. We're dedicated exclusively to US-Asia policy, and in line with those values, we look at a lot of if-then statements, institutionally neutral on positions, but saying if X is your goal, then what are the possible Ys that would either get you there or the outcomes of that? And for our work on energy security in particular, work closely with a number of countries across the region and serve as the official US delegate as part of the Energy Research Institute Network, which is the East Asia Summit process on developing Asian regional energy security. And I'd have to say that the role I've been asked to do tonight is one of my favorite ones for panels. I get to take all of the good work that Alexa and Jessica did in coming up with recommendations and either say, I completely agree and get that benefit, or in some cases raise questions and know that I might not be the one answering them. So, oh yeah. Is this better? Yes. Great. So maybe to dive right into the paper, and knowing that some of this might be updated or a little bit changed, there was a quote in there from Greenpeace that said something to the effect of, Taiwan is in a really unique position of trying to do both zero nuclear and its climate change goals at the same time. And I'd actually dispute that premise from Greenpeace. I think you can say that Germany has attempted to do that, and the outcomes of trying to do that is they've seen their emissions rise. You can say that Japan attempted to do that as well, and the outcomes was both an acceptance of emissions rising and also a rolling back of some of those policies. And you can say that Korea is also looking at that right now too, and is in kind of a similar boat. So I think, one of the values for me of this paper and thinking about the topic is not whether Taiwan is unique in this aspect, but whether if Taiwan has the opportunity to be unique in being the first one to do this successfully, and what might that look like. The paper goes into, and I think did a really great job of outlining size ambitions in this space and their plans for 2025, which in broad terms focus not on meeting rising demand. Between now and 2040, electricity demand is relatively flat in Taiwan, less than 0.5% growth on average each year between now and then, but more bluntly focused on that transformation question that we've heard on. What does it mean to go to zero nuclear? What are the fuels that expand in that? Focusing on both a rising role for renewable and for natural gas. And in those kind of high-level face value terms, that means some of what Taiwan is looking at is not so fundamentally different from what we've seen in Japan and other countries, right? So after Fukushima Daiichi and the triple disaster at Fukushima more broadly, you see the DPJ articulate a plan that has very similar kind of stretches. How can we accelerate renewables at the maximum potential speed and what fills the interim gap? You've heard the Moon government say the same thing, although they're also looking at revising their strategy. So, starting from that base, the question that I have is, teasing out, and I think the paper hits on this well, what's distinctive about Taiwan's situation? Where is it in a similar starting point? Where does it have relative advantages? And also, what are some of those challenges or efforts on the horizon? In a number of places, the paper talks about kind of where we are today in its energy mix, challenges and issues we faced in the last few years, such as questions about resiliency of the grid, what actually happens in terms of getting electricity prices to be a little bit more rational, and kind of pushing that going forward. One of the sources I like to use quite a bit is the work out of NPEC in Tokyo, who tries to say, based on what we see solely on policies and practices in place, modest assumptions in improvements in technology or prices, what's the business as usual scenario, so we can better assess that delta of what really needs to be done. And NPEC projects that through 2040, again, electricity consumption relatively flat overall. They show that nuclear, they built in the assumption of that gradual step down. And what you see in that case is there is some coal gas switching, but a sustained role for coal and a lot of questions about what accelerates that, a growing role for natural gas. And on the emissions side, you see, CO2 emissions make continued improvements and decline until about 2025, but when you have that nuclear phase out, assuming business as usual, you see them spike again. And that's a substantial challenge. And also built into those assumptions of what that picture looks like, NPEC estimates that Taiwan will need, in terms of energy sector investment, on the magnitude of somewhere between 63 billion and 129 billion. And the high-end estimate is that up to 87% of that is just for electricity generation, building out necessary infrastructure there. I think, as will not surprise a lot of people in this room, getting to targets on infrastructure investment and actually coming up with the funds is something where groups regularly fall short on or are challenged. So for me, that's kind of my baseload assessment of what's going on, what's possible. You can say going to zero nuclear, there are a lot of things that are technically possible, but what's probable, and also under what conditions do we reassess or reevaluate policy. For me, I often look at these issues through an energy security lens, and there are a lot of different ways that this can be defined or evaluated. I use an A4S model, which I'll get into in a second, but I think it's a good assessment for taking stock of how governments think about their choices and then unpacking what are the potential sources of strain or pressure point, what are some of the areas that will need continued focus, either in terms of political resources or in terms of capital, and what are some of the changes or factors that may reshape or lead to adjustments in policy. So A4S is basically the 5 things that you want your policy to be. You want to think about energy security as being based on what's acceptable, accessible, affordable, available, and sustainable. And there is really no one-size-fits-all per country. Different countries have various mix that, as you can assume, based on how steep one of those factors might be, just how expensive is energy, just how possible is it to be sustainable, and can lead to a number of recalibrations. So for Taiwan in particular, and thinking about what that scenario looks like, on the acceptable side, I think we've talked quite a bit about the lack of acceptability in nuclear and how that raises questions on public pressure to continue along the path that they've outlined. But under what conditions might that change? I think you very well articulated the question about coal. And one of the recommendations that I felt quite strongly on in the paper as well was the focus on cleaner coal technology, because if you want to talk about reducing emissions, addressing some of those climate goals, taking a huge chunk of your generation and doing it cleaner is a really positive goal. But for public acceptance, sometimes people don't see cleaner technology, even if it's an upgrade to existing plants. Sometimes they just see new building. And we've seen in cases such as Indonesia or Thailand, the Philippines even, public opinion and protests can be very strong against coal as well. In terms of wind and solar, in terms of that acceptability, wind and solar do have very high public opinion rankings broadly across the region as well. That isn't necessarily unique, and that's something that's long been the case. So it favors their continued deployment in line with other conditions, and that gets me to what's acceptable or accessible. Big challenge, and I think the paper hits on this well in terms of Taiwan, is in terms of what's accessible, you have to have this really strong, robust grid. And that's been a challenge for Taiwan. It's a challenge that requires additional investment. It's a challenge that could become a bottleneck in terms of the ability to deploy new and cleaner sources, whether that's wind or solar or other fuels. In terms of affordability, there was a point on the paper that I wanted to touch on. I think you said quite well the price. And Taiwan is in that unique case where at face value, energy is or electricity in particular is quite affordable in Taiwan. It's held at quite a low price. But addressing what really makes things affordable in terms of the desirability for an investment environment, to move forward on other sources, and also address some of the shock of what might happen with a change in nuclear, you might need to see a move to a more rational market where those prices could rise. And you need to have a government and policy in place that very clearly communicates how that aligns with value, or ideally speaking too, talking about the opportunity we have now of a lot of prices having come down so significantly, taking action now, versus waiting for natural gas prices to rise or other disruptions in the market that could add to your challenges. Maybe just a quick pitch for the feed-in tariff comment that was in there. I thought that was a really good point to hit on. And the only thing that I'd hit is that feed-in tariffs are quite good in terms of allowing this kind of introductory rate and bringing it up to scale. But cases such as Japan and others can be quite instructive of how you really want to have this constructed both in a good, solid way and give regular touch points for revisiting your assumption. Japan, for example, hit their feed-in tariffs in a way that assumed certain things about renewables, wind and solar being equally competitive. Markets changed, they got way more solar. I might grab this water. I'm too excited. Solar was very attractive and perhaps more attractive than you'd want it to be for the grid. So regular touch points to address that, very good. Two last ones, the availability. This is a really positive story right now. You have, in terms of natural gas markets, really an abundance of supply that even 5 years ago just was not there in terms of both the sources and what's available at a low price point. You also have dramatic declines in prices for wind and solar. I think there was a point in the paper that talked about the geopolitics of natural gas and the sources that Taiwan does have for it. There's a quote that I like from Damien Ma, I'm going to paraphrase roughly, that says something like, "There is every reason to believe that the geopolitics of natural gas will not be as politicized as the geopolitics of oil." And that has to do both with the abundance of supplies, but also the diversity of the supplier map. When I think about Taiwan's goals in terms of diversification and structure, hearing that current suppliers are Qatar, Indonesia, Malaysia to a degree is a very good, stable map. The opportunity for the United States and others to play more of a role, also great. Last point maybe is where that fits into the sustainability equation, because there is good, strong momentum on that, both at the national policy level, but also in terms of domestic constituencies who are likely to continue to press for that, even with the change in nuclear policy, continuing to press towards that lower carbon transition. One thing I would put a plug in, the paper does a great job in hitting on the renewables target. NPEC did a study that looked at where dollar for dollar investment could be effective. And their point that they came to was that for Taiwan, investments in energy efficiency would actually pay themselves back in terms of lowering overall costs, in terms of requirements to go into the energy sector, as well as saving an overall fuel sector. So accelerating energy efficiency is a huge opportunity for Taiwan. Because I'm apparently losing my voice, I will maybe leave it right there, but just say, I think this is an incredibly important paper for the United States. It's important both because of our good, strong partnership with Taiwan, but also its opportunity to serve as a regional benchmark and good example of best practices in an area where there is genuinely limited opportunities for best practices. So.